Well, good morning. Welcome to Wednesday Workshop at Be So Creative Studios. I have a t-shirt to make for you today. I've been promising you that we're going to go through all the steps of making a t-shirt. I'm actually wearing one of them today that I made for you, and they're very simple to make once you get the hang of it, once you get a real pattern that you really like. We are going to be offering these instructions. You can do this with any t-shirt pattern. It's just a basic front, back, sleeves, and some kind of a band on the top for the neckband. And so we'll have our version of this here. I think I had it upside down, sorry. We'll have our version of this here. You can use it with any pattern, but these are the general instructions. And so just to get you started, when you're dealing with these knit fabrics, you have to remember that knit t-shirts have a solid front and a solid back. There's no center seam. So you have to take your fabric, take the two selvage ends, fold them towards each other, and use the fold on this side and the fold on that side to cut your front and back. That's a little bit different than regular, maybe sewing a blouse or other garments. Then we're going to be cutting out the sleeve, and the sleeves, I have noticed, and I have made quite a few versions. It took me 2 or 3 t-shirts until I got the fit exactly the way I like. And what I suggest is that you take your t-shirt pattern, lay it out, then grab a t-shirt you already have that you love. This is a Liz Claiborne t-shirt that I really like. And you can fold the t-shirt in half, fold the front in half there, and you can actually lay this out on your pattern and decide where they have put the shoulder seams, how deep they've cut the armholes, how they've flared, how much they've flared the waistline, the length, the contour of the neckline. All of those things you can imitate. It's also a great way to figure out what size you want to cut out of that pattern, because usually patterns come in multiple sizes and you think, I don't know which size to cut. Lay a t-shirt that you love out like that, maybe on just the front piece, and get an idea of what size pattern translates into that one you like. The best case scenario is take a t-shirt that you've worn out, your favorite one, before you throw it out, save it, cut right up the seam lines, and cut you out a front, a back, and a sleeve piece on it, and lay that down on top of a pattern, and you can contour a pattern exactly to fit you. Then what I do is I trace my pattern onto this tracing paper. It's called Pattern Ease. It's nice and sturdy, much sturdier than tissue paper. You can transfer markings on it, and I have a pattern I can use over and over again. So just a few little preliminary things that you might do over time to get your pattern, to get a pattern that fits you. And once you get a pattern that fits you, you never have to try on. The whole process is so quick that I can lay everything out, cut it, and make it in a half an hour. I don't have to stop and try on or redo anything. So I want to go, and by the way, I am going to sew this today on a serger. And I have a baby lock. I have the Accolade out today. It's a serger and also does a cover stitch. You can make this on a sewing machine, and if you are using a sewing machine, I suggest you use a stretch stitch, which looks like a little jagged lightning bolt. Look in your user's manual and figure out which is this stitch made for stretch. You do need something that will give as you pull those seams up and down. Otherwise, you'll snap the threads right out of it. All right, let's get started. We're going to look down here at our table, and I'll show you how I put these pieces together. So I have the back of my t-shirt laid out with the right side up. And now I'm going to take the front piece and lay it right side down so that I have right sides together. I'm going to start with the shoulder seams, and I'm going to be aligning the top edges of both shoulder seams, left and right, right sides together. When you get to this point, it can be a little tricky here because you kind of want to align those edges up exactly right, but that would not be correct. What you need to do is you have to think about where your 1/4 of an inch seam is here, and that 1/4 of an inch seam needs to line up with this 1/4 of an inch seam. So watch what I'm going to do. I'm going to scoot that fabric over just a little bit, and it looks like it's not aligned there, but it is. That's correct because at 1/4 of an inch, the edges are going to meet. So that's how you align. And over here too, I make sure that 1/4 of an inch down, my edges meet. I'm going to put a couple of pins in there to hold it in place. All right, so I'm just going to align my raw edge right just past the knife there. My knife is just going to shave off a tiny little bit of that. I'll take my pin out as I go. Sometimes that filmy knit gets away from me right at the end there. And there are my shoulder seams now. And I'm going to take this over to the ironing board and I'm going to press these. I can never decide if I want them to the front or the back. Just do them both the same. It doesn't really matter. I'll press these and I'll meet you back on the table over here. All right, now I end up with one big piece here connected at the shoulder seams. And sometimes once you get to this point, it's hard to remember where the front and back are. The back edge is usually straighter and has less curve, and your front edge is usually your curvier, rounder, depending on your neckline. And of course, you can do any type of neckline line you want. I do a crew neckline with this, but just to remember, I'm going to go ahead and put a pin in the front so I can remember that that's the front. Here, I'll use the yellow one. It'll show up a little better, just so I can remember that that's the front of my fabric. The next thing I need to do is sew on the neckband, and this can be the trickiest part of the t-shirt because I need to know what this measurement is before I cut that piece. So we are going to take a measuring tape and we're going to measure all the way around this opening, remembering that we're going to go down about 1/4 of an inch because that's where the actual sewing is going to take place. That will be the actual opening of the neckline. Now, this can be difficult to do, and I have found it a little bit easier if I fold this in half like this, long ways, and align my shoulder seams, my excuse me, what are they called? Armhole openings. I align my armhole openings here. And then you can go and align your shoulder seams. You're basically folding it back onto the front seams, the front of the front and back pieces. And that's just so much easier to measure, isn't it? All I have to do is take that measurement and double it. So here I go. I'm going to start here right at that fold. I'm going to go around. Let it stand right up on its end, and mine is coming out to 10 3/4 inches. I'm going to do it this way so you can see my measuring tape of what I'm looking at here. Standing it right up on its end. And again, I'm getting 10 3/4 inches. I need to double that because I've got it folded in half. So that's going to be double 10 is 20, and then I'm going to add another 1.5 inches. So I've got 21.5 inches, and that is the measurement of my neck opening. And I want to write that number down because I forgot to warn you, there is going to be some math. So the math that we're going to do here is we're going to take the 21.5 inch number that I had, which is my circumference of my neckline. And I want to take 3/4 of that measurement. I need my neckband to be smaller than this opening so that it will kind of snug it in and make the whole thing lay flat and smooth up against my neck. So in order to take 3/4 of that measurement, the easiest way to do it is just to multiply by 0.75. So if I have 21.5 and multiply by 0.75, I get the number 16.125. So that is the measurement I want my band to be. But I have to remember when I'm cutting it that I need a seam allowance on the back of my band. And so I have to allow an extra ½ inch for that seam allowance. And then it's good to just allow another inch or inch and a half for ease, so it's not so tight that it puckers the fabric. And so I add an inch and a half with this knit. Now different knits may stretch differently, but with this knit, I like to use an inch and a half. So that means I'm going to take that number 16.1 and add 2 inches to it. And that is what I'm going to actually cut out of my fabric. And that ends up being 18.125 or 18 1/8 inches. So that's how you can figure out how to cut your band. So this band is just a strip of fabric. It is 1½ inches wide, and then the length is going to be that number that you came up with when you did all of that math. It's going to be different for every person because your measurements are going to be different. And that's what the neckband looks like. That's all there is to it. So I'm going to take the neckband, fold it in half, and I have to sew it into a circle. So I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch seam. I've already allowed for that seam allowance, so I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch seam into that. All right, I'm back and I have sewn that seam a 1/4 inch, so I just have a tube. So now I have a circle here. I have a circle here. How do I get those two things aligned? Well, I want to be sure that I have the same amount of stretch and ease all the way around. So the best way to do that is to divide both circles, this one and this one, into fourths. And so I'm going to take some pins here to do my marking. Now I'm really glad that I put my pin to remind me of the front here, because when I come over here and start sewing, I want to put the seam in the back. I don't want that line going down the front of my t-shirt. I have done it before, and I guess I kind of got away with it. It was real forgiving fabric. I didn't want to take my neckband out, but it's frustrating when I forget to do that. So the first thing I'm going to do is divide my shirt into quadrants. So I'm going to do that little thing I did again where I folded it in half along the center front and center back lines. And I'm going to put a pin right down the center front line, right down the center back line. Now, it's very tempting at this point to think, well, I could just use my shoulder seams as my other indicator, but you can see that they are not a 1/4 inch away. There's a lot less room in the back than there is in the front. So that is not the mark that I need to use. I need to take these apart now, and now I'm going to put my center front and center back together, and there is the mark. And you can see it's in front of, it's about an inch or an inch and a half to the front of, or actually to the front of that shoulder seam. So don't be deceived by thinking that shoulder seam is where you're going to line up one of your marks. So I need to make a mark there as my 3rd quarter and a mark over here as my 4th quarter, and I'll spread it out and show you now what this looks like when it's all marked up. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, and I know that those are equidistant from each other, exactly a 1/4 of a way around the band. Now I'm going to do the same thing. It's easier with this one. I'm going to do the same with this one. I'll fold it in half at the seam line. If you want the seam right directly in the back, I usually put mine right in the back. So there's the halfway mark. I'll put a pin in that. And then I'm going to take my halfway mark and my seam, line them up, And now I can get my other 2 quadrants. There's a 1/4 of an inch there and another 1/4 of an inch there. So here is what my band looks like now. Each pin is a 1/4 of the way around. Now it's just a matter of matching up the pins on the band to my neck opening. So again, be mindful of where your front and back is. I have my front pin here to remind me. So this is the back. So I'm going to take my back piece here and I'm going to align the seam allowance, the seam, with the back center mark. And I'm going to put a pin right there so those can stick together. So there's my first one done. I think the next one I'm going to do is come along and do my front. So I'm going to take my front pin, align it with my center front mark here on that pin. And now I've got my front and my center. Now I'll come and do these quadrants. Match the pins, remember, not the seam allowance, match the pins. And over here, one more pin. And it looks a little odd, but I've now got it pinned correctly. It's only pinned in the 4 places. And now, probably the most difficult part here is the actual serging of this. Now, if you are new to serging and you don't feel like you have a lot of control yet on your serger, you can go ahead and baste this in with your sewing machine. Do a long basting stitch. That way it will be in place when you go over to the serger if you have a hard time wrangling your fabric at the serger. But I'm going to go ahead and do it right on the serger. I'm going to show you how I just very easily and carefully and slowly work my way around the circumference of the neckline. Let's go over to the machine. I don't like to start right on the lumpy seam allowance because it can be a little difficult to get it to run smoothly under this. So I'm gonna think of starting maybe just behind it a little bit, maybe an inch or 2, or actually I'll start in front of it. We don't have to worry about it. I'm gonna start my stitching right about here. So I have to raise my presser foot. Of course, by now I'm gonna have to take my pin out, and I'm gonna scoot this underneath until my needle is at that starting place where I want it to start. I'll lower my presser foot here. And I'm going to go ahead and lower my needles into there because I want to keep this from moving on me. You will notice that the band that you cut is much smaller than the actual neckline opening. And that's because we need to get that stretch in. So what I have to do is pull. You can see now why I put my needles down. I don't want to pull my fabric right back up. I have to stretch that neckband so that it comes out to be the same length as the opening in the garment, in the back piece. And so now that I've got it stretched out there, I'm ready to serge. And here I go. Just sew for about an inch or 2, then always be checking, making sure there's nothing, any stray fabric has wandered underneath your machine. Stretching out again. And I'm just about to come up to my first quadrant here, the end of my first quadrant. So I'm going to take that pin out. Always make sure your needles are down in when you go to adjust so you don't lose traction. And now I'm going to pull the next quadrant so that it matches the neck opening. And here I go. If you want to be aware, I should have told you earlier, if you might want to be aware of which direction your seam allowances, your shoulder seam allowances go, so that they stay put. You could put a pin in that if you're wanting them to go the same direction. And I'm just about home. This knit does curl up a little bit on the edges. And I'm ready to go meet. And now I know I've already crossed over where I started, so you can just sew right off the edge there. Now you have several options about the style of this band, the way you want it to look. I'll show you this one here. This was a Liz Claiborne shirt that I purchased, and they had actually just folded the band in half before they sewed it on. Just folded, it looks like it's a little bit wider than ours, folded it in half, and then just serged it and turned the whole serging to the back. That would be one option for you. The way I like to do it is I like to take this raw edge and fold it over my serged seam allowance there. So here's my seam allowance. I'm just folding it over. It feels very much like quilt binding. And I fold it over just like that. At this point, I would take it and I put a few pins in to hold it. And I would go all the way around like that. Now I am leaving a raw edge. Raw edges are okay on knits. They don't fray like wovens do. So that raw edge is just fine with me. And now what I will do, and I'm going to demonstrate this next week on our next show, but this is the place where I would get my sewing machine out and I would actually sew right in that ditch and just stitch in the ditch with a color similar to my shirt and allow that stitch to go ahead and catch that raw edge on the other side. Now this can be tricky because your stitch needs to stretch a little bit. This is going to be something that stretches a lot as you wear it. And so you don't want to put a regular stitch in there. You may need to go ahead and use your little stretch stitch under there. But I have even a better way that I like to do it. And I guess the only way I can show you is just to show you on one of the t-shirts that I'm wearing right here. So let's just look at my t-shirt right here. There we go. So on my t-shirt, here is the raw edge that I just folded over, but I used a double needle on mine. So I'm going to show you next week how I finish this with a double needle. And one needle goes here, where am I? One needle goes here on this side, and then I let the other needle be here. I just follow along my seam line and look how accurately that double needle puts that in. And the great thing about double needle is underneath the double needle does a zigzag. And so guess what? I have stretch now in that. I've covered up all those raw edges, and I actually went back with little scissors and trimmed my raw edges so they would be right next to the stitching. So next week, I'm going to demonstrate that little technique on the sewing machine. We are going to stretch out one sleeve area here, one armhole opening. And now I'm going to take my sleeve. And by the way, I have noticed that a lot of patterns that you buy just make a sleeve that's symmetrical with itself. You can fold it in half and it's the same on both sides. But what I noticed in ready to wear when I started taking apart those favorite t-shirts that I loved so much, in ready to wear, the sleeves are not the same on both sides. They actually have usually cut more fullness on the back side where your shoulder is a little bit bigger and wider. And so I have found by adding that extra fullness on the back that my shirts fit better. They don't ride up so badly. And so on this one, I have marked the front. I just put pins in the form of an F. That's how I remember that that's the front. So I know that this is the front of my sleeve. Of course, I know where the back of my garment is here. And so I want to make sure that the back of my sleeve is aligned with the back of the garment. I want it to go right sides together. Here's the back of my garment. Here's the back of my sleeve. The only marking I have in my sleeve is I have snipped the shoulder seam that was in my pattern. I went ahead and put a little snip on that. And so I am now going to align that little snip with my center shoulder seam, the center of my shoulder seam, just like that. The next thing I'm going to pin is I'm going to come over here and pin my edges here. So you pin the side seam to the side seam of your sleeve. And now you have to go and do the other thing. And the whole thing just kind of wads up. It would be so nice if you could just keep this nice and flat, but you can't because this is a three-dimensional part of your body. You can't lay a shoulder area out flat. There's too many dimensions to worry with. So it kind of looks like a big mess, but you can see that that's going to create the cap on the sleeve. And so now all I have to do is come over and if you want, because of all these curves, you can go ahead and put an extra pin in the middle of your sleeves just to keep the fabric wrangled in. Your sleeve is cut slightly bigger than the arm opening. So the arm opening is going to have to stretch a little bit to accommodate all that fabric in the sleeve. When we use wovens, you know, we always sew the easement line in there and then we gather a little bit and create ease. Well, with knits, you just create the ease by stretching the short fabric and making it fit into the long fabric. So again, I just take a few stitches, stretch, remove my pin, stretch so that your fabrics align. Watch out underneath that you don't get these folds tucked under, because I almost got one under there, and you certainly don't want one to get caught in the knife there and cut. So be sure that what's on the bottom is nice and flat as it's going under the presser foot. This is what you do if you don't pin. You just kind of align and stretch. And when you open this up, you're going to see that you've created that nice little cap right there on your sleeve. And then you're going to go ahead and do the same thing on the other side, sewing your other sleeve in place. Now, once your sleeves are in place, actually before I do this, just as a little hint, it doesn't even say this on the pattern, but I like at this point to go ahead and press up my hems. I just press them. It usually asks for about a 1-inch hem. I make a press there. I come and do it in my sleeves. It's easy while your sleeve is still straight and not closed at the sides. It's nice to just come and press that up with your iron. You're not going to sew it yet, but you'll be happy later on that you put that press in when you did. And so here's the place where you are going to put your right sides together. Align your hems. align your shoulder seams, and I like the seams to be pressed towards the sleeve, so I make them bend over towards the sleeve. And I like to open this up and just see if they look aligned there. And when I get them aligned and I get those seam allowances up, I like to put a pin there to hold the seam allowances in place and to keep that seam aligned. Just one pin right there is all you really need. And then I am going to go ahead and pin the very edge of my sleeve, and I'm going to pin the edge of my hem at the bottom of the garment. Now I have found I like sewing from the bottom up better, and that's just because when I get to this seam here, it's going to keep it moving forward, and I don't have to try to jam it in there, get it going in the right direction. So let's go over and we'll sew up our side seam. These should match perfectly. There's no stretching involved on these two seams. It should be a one-to-one relationship. Just going to send it under there, and now I may have to tug in the back a little bit just to get the fabric to move under there smoothly. Sometimes that soft knit does get in the way. I'm just going to move that seam allowance out of the way there. Now here I have a pretty drastic kind of corner to go around. And so I'm going to just see if when my needles get right up to this point, right about there, I'm just going to turn it, kind of let it come back down the other side. So I create that little V. That way I've created that little V in there that I can come back and turn up. All right, and so this is what it looks like when I'm turning it inside out. Oh, I got those lined up pretty nicely there. There's my finished seam, and I'll do that on both sides. And all I have left now on this one is just to turn up and hem my sleeves, hem the bottom. So next week when we come back, I'll have my sewing machine set up, and I'll have my serger converted over to doing cover stitch, and I'm going to hem the bottom with the cover stitch. So that should get you partway through your shirt for now. And you can see that I think we did it under half an hour. And so I hope yours is coming out just as successfully. Look on our website and we'll have the instructions for this up for you. And I hope you have great success. I'll see you back next week on Wednesday Workshop and we'll finish up.